Hello everyone, welcome to this Melbourne Writers' Festival event where it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with one of the most gifted, well-read, wise, even funny essayists writing in English today. Eliot Weinberger is not only an essayist but a translator and a literary critic. For the past 13 years or so I've broadcast his fascinating and eccentric essays on Radio National about a rabbit whose teeth grew and grew and grew, about a dog who was used to predict the future in ancient India, a prose poem about all the dreams people have had in the Icelandic sagas. His loves and his hates and his interests span the globe, and his ideas run from anthropology to history to poetics to politics and many other topics in between. He edited a book of Borges's selected non-fictions published in 1999, which won the American National Book Critics Circle Prize for criticism. And he's the primary translator of the work of Mexican poet Octavio Paz in English. And he was the first American to be awarded the Order of the Aztec Eagle by the government of Mexico. But perhaps his most well-known work was an essay called What I Heard About Iraq. It was a collage of the statements made by American administration officials and their allies leading up to the war. And then after the war began, of these same officials, as well as American soldiers and Iraqi citizens. It's a kind of history of the Iraq War in sound bites from 1992 to January 2005. After its publication in the London Review of Books, it was the most visited article ever on the magazine's website. It was reproduced or linked on some 100,000 other websites. It's been translated into many languages, and a sequel called What I Heard About Iraq in 2005 is reproduced in this most recent collection of essays called Oranges and Peanuts for Sale. It's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Eliot Weinberger. Please welcome him to the Melbourne Writers' Festival.
Thanks, Ramona. And now I have to praise you, because last night I went to the Jonathan Franzen speech, and I've, like everybody else, I've read 1,000 things about the corrections, but I don't really read American realist fiction, and so I've never had any desire to read it. But then after your introduction, I thought, gee, maybe I really should read that. So I want to tell you that you are the embodiment of infectious enthusiasm.
Well, thank you very, very much. Because you are the embodiment of infectious curiosity. You are curious. You are completely curious. It seems to me about all kinds of things, and your curiosity takes you and takes us as your readers to the most marvelous places. And today I want to talk about all the different things you do and the different things you write and the different approaches you take, and to find out what makes you so curious, what makes you you. But before we do that, Elliot, I want to ask about something, a rumour that I heard, that you've been investigated by the Australian Human Rights Commission.
That is true. You didn't know that I'm a human rights abuser. It's kind of a long story, and I can't really tell you the details because I'm afraid it's going to start the whole process over. But I was indeed investigated by the Australian Human Rights Commission. And it's because I wrote an essay. I wrote an essay about a tiny religious minority in the Middle East. And this is a minority that's existed for at least 2,000 years. And they have a lot of they have a very beautiful mythology and a lot of strange beliefs. For example, they have a god who is half man and half book, and he sits in eternity reading himself. And this group has also, in their traditional writings, said a lot of unkind things about the three great monotheisms of the Mideast: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, which probably is not shared by contemporary practitioners, but it's in their traditional writings. So in my essay, I talk about all of these things. and it was published in Harper's Magazine. And there was a coda in Harper's saying that these people have also been subject to tremendous persecution since the rise of various jihadi groups in the Middle East. Anyway, a member of that religious group in Australia took great offense at the article and lodged an official complaint with the Australian Human Rights Commission for racial vilification. And the way it works is there's 3 stages. The first stage is the determination. They have to decide whether or not this is a case that should be investigated. The second stage is reconciliation, where they try to bring the 2 groups together. And if that fails, the third case is, the third stage is one can be subject to federal prosecution in Canberra. And I knew, of course, that I wouldn't get to the third stage because as we well know, the United States does not extradite for human rights violations. Otherwise, Washington would be half empty. So the first stage, determination, they sent me 40 pages of documents of things that I had to fill out. Who am I and so forth. And then what is the nature of this magazine, Harper's? Is it an Aryan Nation magazine or so forth and so on? And I kept trying to tell them, that this is a case where the guy should write a letter to the editor and they'll undoubtedly publish it. But they determined that the case should go forward to reconciliation.
Well, can I ask,
yeah.
what was the element of the essay that was so offensive?
Well, I think it was because I mentioned some of the unkind things that they had to say about the other monotheisms. And
knowing you would have chapter and verse.
Oh yeah, it's thoroughly documented, but and it's probably the people today probably don't think those things, and they certainly don't think them publicly. So I think this is what offended this person. So then it went to the reconciliation stage, and actually Harper's had to hire lawyers because they were afraid that Harper's Magazine could get banned in Australia if it was found to be a magazine promoting racial vilification. So then the second half of the story is even more unbelievable. So this is where your tax dollars have been going lately. The second half of the story is even more unbelievable because I'm sitting in a cafe. I live in New York City in Greenwich Village, and I'm sitting in a cafe in Greenwich Village and with a friend of mine, and I'm telling him the story of what's going on in Australia. And there's a man sitting next to me, alone at a table next to me, and he says, excuse me, but I should tell you that I'm a federal prosecutor in Canberra, and I specialize in the various ethnic minorities. And I have worked very closely with, and he named the actual name of the Australian branch of this religious minority, which I had not mentioned. And he said, and so if your case does come to trial, I will probably be the prosecutor, and I don't think you should be talking about this in front of me. Oh my God, it's like the Australian CIA is after me.
So who moves tables, him or
what?
you?
So then I tried to sort of, but he was a kind of humorless lawyer type, and I tried to tell him the story, and he said, I'm sorry, I cannot be talking about this, And it turned out he was on holiday in New York for a couple of weeks, and they just happened to be sitting there. Just amazing. So ultimately, the case was decided that the guy would write a letter to Harper's, which they indeed published, and that was the end of it. And so I don't have to stand trial in The Hague or anything like that.
So I was going to sort of be admiring about your bravery about coming to the Melbourne Writers' Festival.
Yeah, no.
Under such circumstances.
I think I'm safe.
I mentioned that you would know the facts and you would have chapter and verse. And this is because I've often sort of said to you over the years, now come on about your essay, this can't be true. This must be a hallucination of yours. But this is not what you do.
I'd never hallucinate.
Tell me about you and the facts, just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah, well, I think it's because I basically have no imagination. So, so I just, in my essays, the one rule of thumb I have for my essays is that I don't make anything up. So everything is independently verifiable somewhere. Um, and, or they are the things that somebody has believed to be true. Um, and so I start from that premise in terms of writing an essay, and then after that, in terms of the form of the essay, then it just takes off from there. Because the essay, it seems to me, is very stuck in kind of 18th century models in English, and it's never really had an avant-garde in English. So because of that, it's kind of unexplored territory. And so you can basically do anything you want with the essay, except that very few people are doing it.
In other
Seems to
languages,
me.
has there been an
Yeah,
avant-garde?
in other languages, there's more of an avant-garde in terms of the essay, and you're freer to do things, even in the newspapers and so forth. That in other languages, poets and fiction writers, have regular columns in newspapers and things, and there's much more of a freedom in terms of what you can do. You have this tradition of the feuilleton, which is basically a writer just going on about whatever they feel like going on about and so forth, which doesn't exist at all in the United States anyway.
So, were you shocked, surprised, gratified at the reception of your what I heard happen?
Yeah, I was amazed. I mean,
Now, how did it start?
well, it started because at the time, I mean, it's hard to recuperate what was happening at the time, but at the time, at least in the United States, we were living, the media was quite similar to being in the Soviet Union in that you basically only heard what the government wanted you to hear. And to get opposition opinions or even information, one had to rely entirely on the internet and reading the foreign press and so forth. And I can't really imagine the Bush years without the internet in terms of that. And it seemed that there had been this kind of collective amnesia about how we had gotten into the war in Iraq. So I just kind of put together this collage of, as you said, sound bites, all of it, verifiable of the kind of language and the things that were said about the weapons of mass destruction and so forth and so on, leading up into the war and then the actual war itself. And at the time, my political articles were written for magazines and newspapers abroad, and in English what I did was I sent them as emails to friends. And it's a wonderful way to publish, actually, for that kind of thing, because the reader votes with his or her forward button. So if they like it, they send it on. So these things took on a life of their own on the internet. And so it actually had went out on the internet, and then the London Review of Books picked it up, and then it got, it just kind of took off in that sense. And then a guy in Los Angeles turned it into a play, and the play ran for 8 months and then toured England, and then people did dance performances of it and art installations, and it just went on. And then the sequel, What I Heard About Iraq in 2005, someone wrote a play, a radio play here for the ABC, and I think it won some prize here too. And that's actually was a very moving performance because they did it in all different voices, including a bunch of children who happened to be touring the ABC studio at the time they were recording it. So then you hear some like 10-year-old speaking the words of Donald Rumsfeld, and it's truly creepy. And I think that the success of it was really because there was nothing else. It's not that it was so great. It's curious that the Iraq War, unlike the Vietnam War, really produced no poetry. It didn't produce any really memorable songs. There's basically nothing came out of it that kind of fired the popular imagination, quite the opposite of Vietnam.
And each chime, I suppose, begins, I heard that.
Right.
I heard that. I heard that this happened. I heard that that happened. And it seems that you were taking what you know about poetry and applying it to a big prose piece like that.
Yeah. And also that essay has, there's no overt opinion. Obviously there's opinions that are expressed in it, but there's nothing where I'm actually commenting on anything. It all sticks to the facts and the actual quotes. But it's true that I try to write essays the way one writes poetry, in that I'm listening to the sentences, and I'm more concerned with those kinds of musical things, and also making the kind of leaps that you can make in poetry, which without necessarily filling in all the gaps the way one often does in prose.
Are you a person who is glued to the television, glued to the internet? Are you a news junkie? It seems like, I was just wondering, when are you getting the time to be a news junkie and read all the poetry and think about the arcane facts of Indian civilization and?
No, I'm not. I'm not glued to television. No, but. Well, the internet's kind of ruined my life. Just like. I had kind of amassed. At the time that I did what I heard about Iraq, because of the absence of information in the major media in the United States, there were all these people out there who were gathering articles from the world press and then emailing them around. And so it was amazing. One of the great things about the internet is it has spawned, 1 million investigative journalists, so that if the New York Times or whatever isn't covering things, then there's all these people out there who are covering it. So I had kind of amassed a huge archive of these things that people had sent me over the years on my computer. So when I had to when I did what I heard about Iraq, then I could, research through all this stuff that was just kind of there on the computer.
You were very prescient about the internet, I think, years ago. You thought it was going to be very important for the literary world.
Yeah, it's funny because, I forget what year it was, but pretty early on, I was asked to. There's a place in New York City called the St. Mark's Poetry Project, which is a kind of hip poetry scene, and they had a kind of a conference that was on revolution in poetry. And so I got up, and this is like in the late 80s or something, and I said that the major political force in the future is going to be the internet. And basically, I got booed off the stage. They thought that was the most ridiculous thing that they'd heard. And somebody said, bunch of yuppies with laptops are not going to make the revolution and stuff. So it was incredible. But I thought that from the beginning that the internet would be wonderful for literature, because the internet is a great place for people with minority interests. And so, if you're a fan of a forgotten silent movie star or something, you can find the 200 other people in the world who are also fans. And poetry especially is like that. It will always be a minority interest. And yet and so thanks to the internet, all these people can find each other, and even more importantly, they have access to text. So if you are a sensitive young person somewhere in the outback of Australia, you don't have to move to Melbourne or Sydney or wherever, to get these texts now. You can, it's all there that's available. So I think it's been wonderful for that. And I also am one of the few writers that actually likes Google Books and things like that, because I think, the great problem in the third world is libraries, and there's always these kind of projects of trying to create libraries in Africa or Latin America or so forth. and it's very difficult to ship the books and so forth and so on. And with the internet now, there are these, an instant library is available as soon as you have some sort of internet connection. So this is going to change everything. It's wonderful.
I think that we'd all like to see what's in this little yellow folder here that Eliot Weinberger has in front of him. Because
it's a complete dossier on you, Ramona, actually.
Because I know that there's some unpublished pieces there, and we'd like to hear Elliot read something to us. A lot of you may not have read some of the other of Eliot Weinberger's work, which has not much to do with Iraq or Rumsfeld or George W. Bush, and I think it'd be lovely to hear some of the new stuff.
Okay. So let's see. See if I can change my glasses without knocking my microphone off. So I've been writing just lately some essays that are less than 1 page long. So I thought I would read just 3 of them. They're super short. And all 3 of these are about India. India is the place where I try to spend a lot of time. And they don't have any titles, and that's it. Each year in the village of Pulapudipet in Tamil Nadu, a very young girl is selected to marry a frog. The customs of a traditional Indian wedding are followed. Half the village becomes the bride's family and half the groom's. Accompanied by a marching band, the groom is led on a white horse to be welcomed at the bride's home. The entire nuptial ceremony is performed. The couple circles the sacred fire 7 times. The edge of the bride's sari is tied to the groom's sash. Their heads are held together by the priest. After the wedding banquet, the frog is released in a pond. The bride returns to her life as a schoolgirl. When she grows up, she is free to take a second, human husband. An Indian journalist visited Paluputapet to witness the ceremony. He asked the villagers why, each year, they marry a very young girl to a frog. No one knew. It was just what they had always done. The Mara in northeast India say that ordinary mortals, when they die, go to Athiki, the village of the dead. There it is night when it is day here, and day when it is night. Fish are bamboo leaves there, and bears are hairy caterpillars. The spirit lives for a long time in Athiki, but ultimately dies and comes back to earth. The spirit of a powerful person turns into a bit of heat mist that rises into the sky. The spirit of a poor person becomes a worm and is eaten by a chicken. They say that when people dream, their souls wander off at the end of a long, invisible string. When they have a bad dream, they tell everyone about it. When they have a good dream, they keep it to themselves. They say that there is a giant ficus tree growing on the moon, and the marks on the moon's face that we see are its branches. Living in the tree is a headless monkey. The greatest hunters go forever to paradise called Peira. It is close to the one God and occupied by few. For one must have killed a man in battle, an elephant, a tiger, a bear, a small tree bear, a sirau, a gural, a maithun, a rhinoceros, a sambor, a barking deer, a wild boar, a crocodile, a hamadryad, an eagle, one of each of the kinds of hornbill, and a king crow. Government troops now keep the peace, and many of the animals are no longer there, so it is unlikely that any Mara will ever go to paradise again. And the third one, which is only a paragraph long, is the Lushe, neighbors of the Mara, believe that earthquakes are caused by the people who live in the lower world shaking the ground to see if anyone is still alive up there. When an earthquake occurs, the Lushe run out of their houses and shout, "Alive, alive," so that those below will know and stop the shaking.
Fantastic. Lots of things there to talk about. Your love of lists, that list of the animals that you had to kill. No wonder there aren't too many left around. But you're a great one for putting lists of things together. And you had a piece in the London Review of Books. I think it was recently the Cloud
bookcase.
Cloud bookcase.
Yeah.
Which was a list of, I've got it here, but a list of all of these unlikely titles that you'd found in ancient Chinese.
Yeah, that's
bookcase.
kind of you can see it on the London Review website. It's a kind of bibliographic prose poem, and so they're all actual classical Chinese books with strange titles, and then also there's little commentaries, descriptions. So it's kind of the bibliography as a prose poem. What should I read you a couple of these or something?
Just read a few so people can know what we mean. Oh, that's the beginning. If you want the beginning.
Oh, okay.
If you have.
Let's see. Sorry, I wasn't. So there. Sorry. There are things like biographies of presumed immortals by anonymous 10th century, biography of Mr. Yang, Imperial Chamberlain, senior assistant of the Donghua Palace and director of destinies, by anonymous 12th century, the Book of Azure Emptiness by Qian Nan, sorry, I wasn't ready to do this.
I'll do it.
What?
I'll do it. It's just about how unlikely the titles are, really, and the way
Code
you
of
put
Gu
them
Cheng
together.
for controlling demons lists 36,000 demons who can be warded off by knowing their names. The meaning of the word or name Gu Cheng is unknown. Comprehensive collection of true facts concerning the land of bliss. Diagrams illustrating the mystery of the cultivation of truth, the mystery of the supreme pole, and the mystery of the primordial chaos. Contains only the diagrams with no explanations. This is a good one. Dividing the pair in a period of 10 days by Wang Che, circa 1183. Collection of poems. The title refers to a pear that the author cut into 55 pieces to give to a disciple. On receiving the 55th piece, the disciple and his wife separated. The Essentials for Preserving Life by Pu Tien Quan recommends that one should avoid noxious winds in the same way as one would avoid an arrow. Fruits, meat, fish, and fowl may be eaten, but no vegetables. 5 Charms of the Mysterious Book by anonymous 4th century. The text includes only 1 charm. And so forth, so forth and so on.
And so forth and so on. But
Yeah.
where did they come from? How did they come to you? And what did you do with them when they got there?
Well, I just, I had a bibliographic sort of reference book, and then I kind of took them out of there. I mean, I like to take like huge books and condense them down to a couple of pages, So I did that when I wrote. I did a thing once about the naked mole rats, and so I was reading this 600-page book on the biology of the naked mole rat, and my family thought I was completely insane, and then I sort of condensed that down into like a 2-page essay, So,
Did they think you were sane then?
no, they still wonder. But then the funny thing is in Germany they love this. I'm sort of like those rock groups that have one-hit record. So in Germany they think I'm the author of Die Nacktmule, which is the naked mole rat in German. And so if I'm at a public event, people request it, and it's like, a beautiful young woman said, "Oh yes, I was reading it in bed to my boyfriend last night," and stuff. I said, "Really? You don't have anything better to read?" It's very funny.
How did you get like this? You must have been a very interesting young man, though.
Yeah,
I mean, and an older man.
I must have been an annoying child. That's what you're trying to say.
But well, Yeah, maybe that's what I'm trying to say. No, I know for a fact that you, when you were about 19 or so, or when you decide to teach yourself Spanish, and you decided to do this by translating some poetry of Octavio Paz, and then someone send your translations to him, or and then Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, then summoned you and said, or before he summoned you, he said, I shall make you my translator in English.
Yeah,
and then
I like
he
this
said,
version
come on
of it.
down.
I like this summoned me and everything. You know, it's like, this is, yeah, I told this story in the translation thing, which was an hour ago, so I hope I'm not repeating myself. Yeah, actually, when I was 13, I discovered this poem by Octavio Paz called Sunstone. And that was kind of the proverbial, book that made me want to become a writer. So in high school, I was translating poetry, Latin American poetry to Spanish poetry, to learn how to write poetry. And I was translating a lot of Paz, but also other obvious people like Neruda, Lorca, Vallejo. And then when I was 18, I met somebody who knew Paz. So I said, well, I've got all these translations sitting in my drawer. And this guy sent them to Paz, who is then the ambassador in India, Mexican ambassador in India. And he liked it a lot, and he asked me to translate this book of his early prose poetry called Eagle or Sun. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself for people who were there earlier. So I had dropped out. I had gone to college for about a year, and then I dropped out, and I was a hippie, and I wasn't doing anything. And so then I could tell my parents I had something to do. I was translate this book. So that's how my relation with Paz started, and then it lasted 30 years until his death.
And what about when he saw you for the first time?
Yeah, he was a little shocked, I mean, my hair is much longer than yours, and, I had beads and all of that sort of stuff. But, he was, an interesting thing about Octavio was he was a great believer in youth. And, for example, when the magazines he edited in Mexico, even quite late in his life, unlike certain magazines that are edited by older people where most of the contributors are quite elderly, not naming any names, he always had lots of young writers writing for it, and he really believed in that. So I think he was a little shocked when I showed up at his doorstep, but I think he liked that.
What didn't you like about university?
Yeah, I mean,
But you're the autodidact, aren't you?
Yeah. I just had an authority problem.
Or weren't they going fast enough for you?
What?
Weren't they going fast enough for you?
No, I don't think it was that. I think we're talking about the '60s, and I was a hippie, and I was at the university that I attended for less than a year was Yale, which was then still a boys' school. And, most of the people there were like George Bush, who was actually there then. It was interesting because everybody you met was a brand name. It's like, hi, I'm Bob Colgate, and I'm Ed Schick, It's sort of like opening up your medicine cabinet. And so there's like about 5 hippies there, it's just terrible. And at the time, it's a different school now, especially since they let women in and so forth and so on. And also about at least half the school were like these really dumb guys from prominent families, which is not quite as true anymore. It's probably now maybe 20% like that, But there really were a lot of those kind of George Bush types, So I just couldn't take it, I've just
written decision points down here, because you
I
wrote
reviewed
this
that.
absolutely vicious review of George W. Bush's, was it memoir, or it was something with his name on it?
Yeah, it's supposed to be his memoir. And the interesting thing about when they review these political memoirs is that they assume this fiction that the person wrote it, and so they wrote, and Bush points out this and so forth and so on, and they even talk about the prose style sometimes, and so forth. Now, obviously, Bush, did not write a word of this book, so I kind of, got rid of that fiction, and then I talk about the sort of the Bush team, the people who are behind writing this thing, and then I go from there into a kind of thing about Foucault and the death of the author, and how this is the most postmodern text because this is a text completely without an author, I mean, it's like been completely created by these unknown people,
But I hadn't realised till you started talking about Yale when you were a student there, how familiar you would be with this whole sort of frat boy.
Well, not exactly. No, I wasn't. No, I can't say I was very familiar. I mean, I wasn't really hanging with these people,
But you were observing them very closely.
Yeah, they were around, So, but I think Bush was extreme because he was actually in a fraternity. They didn't really have fraternities, but they had very small number of fraternities, which he was in, and then he was branding the. I don't know what we can say on television, the posteriors of the pledges. He was branding them with a hot, coat hanger and things like that. He was a fairly extreme person.
But did you have fun writing the review?
Yeah, I had fun. I mean, the London Review asked me to do it, and I wasn't really going to do it because it meant that I had to read the book. But then and I actually did read every word of it too. But then there's this. There was a scene that's revealed in the book, and then I said, okay, well, I can't. I've got to write this review, and that scene is when Bush is 14 or something, and his mother has a miscarriage at home, and Bush drives her to the hospital. I guess he's 16. Drives her to the hospital, and she has preserved the fetus in a jar, and she shows Bush the fetus, the miscarried fetus of his sister in this jar. And I thought, my God, this is something I have to write about. I mean, it's just beyond belief. I mean, the Bush family drama is really something that's
sort of the Addams family.
Yeah, is just beyond anything. So.
Tell me about why you try and spend a lot of time in India.
I don't know. I mean, it's just that's kind of it's one of my homelands there. So.
Why is it one of your homelands?
I don't know. It's just you get addicted to it. So, and so I've spent a lot. I've probably spent about 3 years of my life there on various trips, and traveling in many different parts. But I don't go to an ashram or anything like that.
But these essays there, do they come from places where you've been, or newspapers? Or?
Well, I've been in Tamil Nadu a lot, of course, but I haven't been in the extreme northeast, which is where those two of those tribes, not the village where they marry the girl to the frog, but the other ones, yeah.
And
so this comes from
how
reading.
did you get the story about the village where they marry the girls to the frog?
I got that from the Indian press. Yeah.
What about China and you? Because that's another place that you've been a lot in your imagination, at least.
Yeah, I haven't. Well, I never really went to. I've now been in China, but I'm very close friends with Beidao, who's been in exile since '89, except that just 2 weeks ago they allowed him into China for the first time since '89. And so I always vowed that I wasn't going to go to China until Beidao could go. Then about 4 years ago, I was invited to a poetry festival in Chengdu in Sichuan province. And I called up Beidao and I said, I've been invited to this poetry festival. What do you think? And he said, well, if you wait for me, you'll be too old to enjoy it. So why don't you just go? So I went, and then, of course, when I arrived in Chengdu, it turned out that the police had canceled the festival. But we were all there anyway, so it was terrific. So I've now been a couple of times. I also went a few years later because there's a Chinese billionaire poet. And in fact, I've now met 2 Chinese billionaire poets.
Gee, they must love poetry in China.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. So obviously they didn't make their billions from poetry. And he likes to invite a lot of people on these trips. And so he invited a bunch of writers on a trip in Xinjiang in the far west of China, on the border of Kyrgyzstan, to go on this kind of journey. It was called the Pamir Poets Journey. And it was quite extraordinary because since this guy's a billionaire, all of these kind of generals and governors and things were definitely extremely obsequious to him. And so every time we got off the bus, there would be like lines of girls in native costumes all applauding, and policemen standing at attention and so forth and so on. And then at one place we were met by the governor of this province, who greeted us at the border and then escorted us to the governor's mansion, where a banquet was ready for us. And as a great, in our honor, a horse had been slaughtered. And then we, as the distinguished guests, were supposed to eat the choicest morsels of the horse, which were its intestines and stomach.
Did you?
Yeah. So so it was that kind of scene. But, And then the funniest thing that happened to me on that trip was one day we're at breakfast and they said, well, after breakfast we're going to this meeting and we'd like you to give a short speech. I said, really, what's the speech about? And he said, well, just talk about how glad you are to be here. So I said, okay, fine. So we drive into this town, and it turns out that this town was celebrating its anniversary, and there were 40,000 people gathered in the square, all wearing different colored baseball caps and organized by their baseball caps, a red, yellow, blue baseball caps. And they put me on the dais with all of these generals, and then I had to address the masses. So, comrades. But my speech was quite successful. I praised the local melons.
Of course you did. Well, Beidao, one of the misty poets, I remember. The misty poets.
Yeah, obscure poets is better.
Obscure poets. And you write about Gu Cheng in this book, and another of the misty poets or the obscure poets.
Yeah.
But I noticed that you say you've published this piece over the objections of the Gu Cheng estate, or what was that about?
What happened was...
Why do you get yourself into so much trouble wherever you go?
This is really turning into a therapy session. Why'd you drop out of college? Why are you always in trouble? Thanks, Mom.
Why do you think I look like your mother?
Gu Cheng was an incredible. He's probably the most radical poet in the history of China, and he was a poet in the 70s and 80s, and he was an extremely eccentric person. For example, he always wore this hat which was made out of the pant leg of blue jeans, and he had this sort of conical hat like that, and he was married to a beautiful woman named Xie Ye. And the one time I met him was they had a tour of Chinese poets in the U.S., and we went to Chinatown in New York and to a restaurant. And the first thing was that Gu Cheng picked up the menu, and he ordered something from the menu. And his wife was completely shocked because she said, Gu Cheng never orders in a restaurant. He only eats what's served to him. And then she put a tape recorder on the table and said, everything Gu Cheng says must be recorded. So this entire conversation was recorded, and the whole time his wife is staring at him with total adoration. She never even looked at me. She's just looking at Gu Cheng. Then at one point, Gu Cheng gets up to go to the bathroom. And when he's not there, his wife, who I had just met there, turns to me and says, "I hope he dies." And it turned out that they had this child who she had to, they were living in New Zealand, and an island off of New Zealand. And they were subsisting on nuts and berries that they gathered. And Gu Cheng insisted that he could be the only person, and so they had a child, and she was forced to give it to a Maori family to raise. She said, "I want my child back. I hope he dies." And then the story ends just horribly, because about a year after that, Gu Cheng killed her with an axe and then hung himself. So it's an unbelievable story. And so I was asked, there's a wonderful translation of Gu Cheng's poetry in English, and they wanted me to write the introduction for the book, which I did. But then the Gu Cheng family refuses to accept the fact that he murdered his wife, which of course I say in the introduction, and so they would not allow it to be published as the introduction to the book. So it became a separate article.
I mean, anyone who hears that story can see why you're attracted to it. But what are the elements of these stories that find their way into your work? I'm just trying to understand why they're so fantastic, and how you put them together. A wonderful poet, a tragic story, a kind of madness. All of these things weave themselves through your work.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'm incapable of writing fiction.
Cracked, that
Is there something cracked
about me? No, I
what?
didn't say that. I said, funny that you heard it though.
What? Oh my God.
No, I mean, does there have to be something kind
This is a very tough country, I mean, it's like, I don't know.
I'm one of the nicest people here.
Yeah, I know.
No, but there's something about the stories that just has a twist or something.
Yeah, right. It's just, I can't write fiction. I've never been able to write fiction, and so I'm just, attracted to those kind of stories. I mean, you have this, what's one of the traditional uses of literature is talking about strange stories, and which is why, sometimes I get accused of cultural imperialism, and especially by university students who've been studying cultural studies and all of that kind of thing, and so I always say, well, what am I supposed to do? Just write about middle-aged nerds in New York City, like just myself? I mean, this is one of the literature begins with with strange stories and with visits to other lands and things like that, which is one of the reasons why I've never been interested in reading American realist fiction. Going back to what we said at the beginning, because I don't want to read about divorce in the suburbs. I can make a phone call and hear about that. So I like to read, novels that take me to other cultures, or sometime in the past, 19th century novels, or things like that, things that I don't already know about. And it's very, this realist tendency is very curious, and is not really traditional in literature. I mean, when in Mesopotamia, when they first learned how to write, they didn't start writing stories about an unhappy seller of beans and wheat. They wrote about Gilgamesh going into hell and the floods and things like that. Homer wasn't writing about a a guy who makes feta cheese and has a girlfriend, and stuff. He's writing the Odyssey. It's like going to all these weird places and the strange things that happen. So I think it's a kind of recuperation of these sort of traditional aspect of literature in that sense.
And how did it get to the point? I mean, this is my last question, so I want you to think of your own now. How did it get to the point where a whole culture is writing about itself in this kind of mundane way?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, since the rise of the bourgeois novel. I mean, this has certainly been true. It's just curious to me that people enjoy it so much. I mean, that they like to read about somebody making a call on their iPhone and that kind of thing, and why. I mean, there used to be there was the famous Melville thing about the shock of recognition when one reads, and this is kind of a recognition without the shock. It's just this kind of a blandness. What can we call it? A blandness of recognition, or a slight throb of recognition, or something like that. Which comes from reading that thing, which becomes kind of comforting, I suppose.
Well, I wonder whether the audience would like to ask a question. If you would.
I'm very curious as a little boy. You must have done some quirky things. You must have come from somewhere.
Yeah, where did you come from, Elliot?
Where am I going is the question. No, I don't know. I didn't have an interesting child. And I've never found myself that terribly interesting. And so I never write anything autobiographical. And so, what? Oh, thank you. So, I've basically, I've probably used, the word I in this conversation more times than I have in my complete writings, So, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do in the essay, because, the essay is so locked into this idea of the personal essay, and I wanted to find out about this, therefore I did this, and then I did that, and so forth and so on. So I basically try to write essays without using the first person at all, and so then what can I say? Yeah, I just don't think it's that interesting. My life is of interest to myself, but I don't know why it'd be of interest to anybody else in that sense. So I'm kind of the opposite of Jonathan Franzen. If you were at the speech last night, But not that I'm, criticizing it, but it's just like, it's a complete opposite. Though I will criticize something, though. I mean, one thing he said, if you went to the speech last night, they went on and on about risk, and this has become this cliche of American writing schools. It's risks, and every blurb on a book of poetry talks about the great risks. And I really think this is a lot of baloney, because, we're talking about middle-class Americans who are writing novels and writing poetry. And if you're going to talk about risk, you talk about writing something that's going to throw you in prison or get you exiled or get you executed. And this whole kind of risk fetishism that's true in American writing now really, really bothers me, because there's no risk at all. The only risk is embarrassment. And, we're all embarrassed about ourselves all the time. And so writing, an embarrassing poem, that's not a risk.
A question here.
This might lead on well from what you were saying about your essays. I just wanted to ask you about the remark earlier about the avant-garde essay. You were saying it didn't really exist in English. Maybe you could say something about what it looks like in other languages, how you think it might look in the future, how if you could just say some more things about that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have a couple of examples in English of people really doing something with the essay, most of whom were poets. The first one would be D.H. Lawrence, Studies in American Classical Literature, which is an amazing book. She wrote in the early 1920s, and it is the kind of literary, I mean, when I first read it when I was a teenager, it totally blew my mind that this could be literary criticism and could be written in this style. Since then, I think you have most of the interesting stuff that was done in the essay in English was done by poets. William Carlos Williams in The American Grain, the essays of Charles Olson, Ezra Pound's essays, continuing now through somebody like Susan Howe, I think is really doing interesting things with the essay. And beyond the poets, somebody we were talking about before, Guy Davenport, is a tremendous person. So these are some of the people that have opened up the possibility of the essay. And I noticed that a lot of people in their 20s now have started writing essays and are doing interesting things in the U.S., mainly because it's such an unpopulated territory. I mean, you've got 10,000 poets in America and probably 50,000 fiction writers, and there's about 4 essayists, so that you suddenly feel like, wow, this is open space. This is the outback. I can do anything I want there. So I think the essay is something that more and more people are going to get interested in doing.
Isn't he fantastic? Please thank him. And thanks for coming.